June 4th, 1942. 4:30 in the morning, the Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles northwest of a speck of coral called Midway Atoll. On the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, a man in pajamas stood shivering in the pre-dawn wind. His name was Minoru Genda, 37 years old, commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the architect of Pearl Harbor. And that morning he was burning with pneumonia, too sick to stand upright, too important to leave his post. A thin blanket draped over his shoulders, a cup of tea steaming in his hands, and in his mind, absolute certainty. Below him, on the darkened flight deck, over 200 aircraft were being fueled and armed. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, Zero fighters, the finest carrier aircraft in the world. Around Akagi, in a formation stretching across miles of black ocean, sailed 3 more fleet carriers: Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Behind them, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, 46 destroyers, over 200 vessels in total, the most powerful naval force ever assembled in human history. For 6 months, this fleet had never lost. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Manila, Singapore, the Java Sea. Every ocean they crossed, every enemy they met, destruction. 8 American battleships hit, 4 of them sunk or grounded in a single morning. 85,000 British troops surrendered in a single week. An empire spanning 20 million square miles of ocean, seized in less than half a year. Genda looked out at the shapes of the carriers around him, silhouetted against a lightening sky, and he saw the future. By nightfall, the last remnant of American naval power in the Pacific would be at the bottom of the sea. He was wrong. In 14 hours, 3 of the 4 carriers he could see from that bridge would be burning wrecks. In 14 hours, 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen would be dead. In 14 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy would suffer the first decisive defeat in its modern history, and the myth of Japanese invincibility would sink into the Pacific alongside 4 of its finest ships. This is the story of how it happened, and it begins not with a battle, but with a code. 3,000 miles to the east, in a windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a man in bedroom slippers was reading Japanese mail. His name was Joseph Rochefort, 42 years old, lieutenant commander. He wore an old smoking jacket over his uniform because the basement was cold in the mornings and stifling by afternoon. He worked 18, sometimes 20 hours a day. He had not seen his wife in weeks. His unit was called Station Hypo, and its assignment was simple: break the Japanese Navy's operational code, a cipher known as JN25B, and read the enemy's mind. By May of 1942, Rochefort's team was reading 15 to 20% of Japanese naval traffic. Not the whole message, just fragments, ship names, dates, coordinates, objectives. Enough, if you knew how to piece it together, to see the shape of what was coming. And what Rochefort saw in the intercepts flooding in through April and May was a name that appeared again and again. Oh, AF, an objective, a target, a place the Japanese were about to attack. Rochefort was certain it was Midway. The pattern of ship movements, the concentration of forces, the timing, everything pointed to that tiny atoll 1,000 miles northwest of Hawaii. But Washington did not believe him. Admirals in the Pacific Fleet disagreed. Some believed AF was Alaska. Others suspected the West Coast. One senior officer suggested Panama. Rochefort needed proof. He turned to another cryptanalyst in his basement, Captain Jasper Holmes, 49 years old, a former submariner turned intelligence officer. Holmes proposed something audacious, something risky, something that could reveal to the Japanese that their code had been broken. He suggested a lie. The garrison at Midway, on Rochefort's orders, transmitted an uncoded radio message to Pearl Harbor. It said, in the clear, that the atoll's water distillation plant had broken down and the base was running short of fresh water. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese naval message, coded in JN-25B, reporting that AF was experiencing water shortages. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. Now Rochefort knew the target, and within days, his team would know more. The date of the attack, June 4th. The approach route from the northwest. The composition of the Japanese fleet down to the individual carrier. And most crucially, the one blind spot in the Japanese search pattern where American carriers could hide. Admiral Chester Nimitz, 57 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, sat in his office at Pearl Harbor and read Rochefort's reports. Nimitz was a quiet man, a calm man, a man from the hill country of Texas who spoke slowly and rarely raised his voice. He had inherited a shattered fleet in December of 1941. He had 6 months of defeat behind him and a navy that was outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched in every measurable way. He looked at the intelligence in front of him. 8 Japanese carriers against his 3. 11 battleships against none. 248 aircraft against roughly 233. And he made his decision. He would fight. The Japanese, meanwhile, believed the battle was already won. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 58 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was the architect of the operation. And Yamamoto, of all people, should have known better. He had lived in America. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as Naval attaché in Washington in the 1920s. He had driven across the United States and seen with his own eyes the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the steel mills of Pittsburgh. Before the war, when Japanese hardliners demanded conflict with America, Yamamoto had warned them, "If we fight the United States," he said, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." 6 months had passed, and now Yamamoto was gambling everything on one more battle. Operation My, a plan so complex it required perfect timing across millions of square miles of ocean. A feint at the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north. A landing force to seize Midway. And the main striking force, 4 fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, to ambush and destroy the American carriers when they came to defend the atoll. The plan assumed the Americans would react exactly as the Japanese predicted. It assumed the Americans had no idea what was coming. Nagumo himself, 55 years old, was not a carrier man. He had spent his career in torpedo warfare and cruisers. He knew battleships. He did not know airplanes, and when he first read the plan for Operation MI, he had objected. So had his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, 52 years old, who warned that the operation violated the fundamental principle of concentration of force, spreading the fleet too thin across too many objectives. But their objections were dismissed. Yamamoto had personally overruled them. And so on the morning of June 4th, Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of Akagi in command of the greatest carrier force in history, preparing to fight a battle he had never wanted, to a plan he did not fully believe in, against an enemy he did not know was waiting for him. There was one more piece the Japanese had gotten wrong: the Yorktown. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, 4 weeks earlier, the American carrier Yorktown had been badly damaged. A bomb had punched through her flight deck. Near misses had ruptured her fuel tanks. Japanese intelligence, examining the damage reports, estimated that Yorktown would need 3 months in dry dock before she could sail again. 3 months. She was repaired in 72 hours. When Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, Admiral Nimitz personally walked her hull, standing in oil-soaked water in the flooded compartments, and told the shipyard commander, "I want her ready in 3 days." 1,400 workers boarded her before she was even fully moored. They worked around the clock. Welders on the flight deck, machinists in the engine rooms, electricians rewiring compartments, while damage control teams pumped out flooded spaces. The lights of the dry dock burned all night, visible for miles across the harbor. She sailed on May 30th. Repair crews remained aboard as she steamed toward Midway, still welding, still patching, still working as the ship went to war. The Japanese did not know. They believed there were 2 American carriers in the Pacific at most. There were 3. And the one they thought was crippled in a shipyard was steaming at 20 knots toward the ambush position Nimitz had chosen, a patch of ocean northeast of Midway that Rochefort's intelligence had identified as the one blind spot in the Japanese reconnaissance plan. The Americans called it Point Luck. By the evening of June 3rd, the pieces were in place. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the impossibly repaired Yorktown, waited at Point Luck, under the command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Between them, they carried 233 aircraft and the accumulated hopes of a nation that had known nothing but defeat since Pearl Harbor. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed toward Midway from the northwest, unaware they were being watched, unaware they were being counted, unaware that every course change they made was already known to their enemy. Yamamoto himself, 300 miles behind the carriers aboard the super battleship Yamato, listened to the radio silence and believed it meant safety. On Akagi's bridge, Minoru Genda watched the eastern horizon begin to pale. The wind was cold, his fever burned, but his confidence did not waver. The Americans, he believed, were nowhere near this ocean. The strike on Midway would be a routine operation. Bomb the airfield, land the invasion force. Wait for the American carriers to sortie from Pearl Harbor and destroy them at leisure. At 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo gave the order. 108 aircraft roared off the decks of the 4 Japanese carriers, formed up in the darkness and turned southeast toward Midway. Behind them, on the carriers, deck crews began the standard preparation for the second strike. Reserve aircraft brought up from the hangars, ordnance loaded, fuel lines connected. Everything by the book. Everything according to doctrine. Everything the way it had been done in 6 months of unbroken victory. But 300 miles to the east, on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, another group of young men were being briefed for the mission of their lives. They knew where the Japanese were. The Japanese did not know where they were. And in the next 6 hours, 4 aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the ships that had begun the war at Pearl Harbor, would begin to burn. 5:34 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. A PBY Catalina flying boat lumbering through the gray pre-dawn 100 miles northwest of Midway banked into a turn. Its pilot would remember for the rest of his life. Below him, spread across the ocean like ink stains on silver, were ships. Dozens of ships, warships, big ones. The pilot, Lieutenant Howard 80, 30 years old, keyed his radio and spoke 4 words that changed the war. Many planes heading Midway. 19 minutes later, at 5:53, the radar operators on Midway itself picked up the incoming Japanese strike. Every aircraft on the atoll, Marine fighters, Navy torpedo bombers, Army B-17s, even ancient Vindicator dive bombers. The pilots, called vibrators, scrambled into the sky. The Americans had been waiting. On the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo received the first reports of ground fire over Midway and understood with a cold certainty that surprise had been lost. The airfield was still operational. The defenders were alerted. His strike commander, Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, 29 years old, radioed back at 7 o'clock with a message that would set the disaster in motion. There is need for a second attack wave. Nagumo now faced a choice, his reserve aircraft sitting on the hangar decks of 4 carriers were armed for ship attack. Armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes waiting for the American fleet that intelligence had promised was nowhere near this ocean. If he wanted to hit Midway again, those weapons had to come off. Fragmentation bombs had to go on. It would take an hour, maybe more. At 7:15, he gave the order. Down in the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sweating deck crews began the delicate work of unbolting torpedoes from their racks, wheeling them onto trolleys, wrestling bomb dollies into position. And here, in the pressure of the moment, doctrine failed. Standard procedure required the removed ordnance to be returned to the armored magazines below. But that took time. Time Nagumo did not think he had. So the bombs were stacked on the hangar decks. Torpedoes leaned against bulkheads. Fuel lines snaked between them. The most dangerous cargo a warship could carry, sitting in the open, one spark from catastrophe. And then, at 7:40 in the morning, everything changed. A radio message crackled onto Akagi's bridge from a scout plane launched 30 minutes late from the cruiser tone. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Bearing 010. Distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo froze. Ships, American ships, where no ships were supposed to be. But what kind of ships? Cruisers, destroyers, carriers? The scout had not specified. Nagumo demanded clarification. The scout did not answer for another 40 minutes. 40 minutes in which every bomb being loaded was the wrong bomb. 40 minutes in which ordnance kept piling up on hangar decks. 40 minutes in which the man who had never wanted this command stood on the bridge of his flagship and understood, slowly, that something was terribly wrong. At 8:20, the scout finally reported what it saw. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier. A carrier. Nagumo reversed his order. Take the fragmentation bombs off. Put the torpedoes back on, and now, on hangar decks slippery with fuel and cluttered with ordnance the crews had no time to stow. The chaos deepened. 300 miles to the east, on the deck of the USS Hornet, 15 men were climbing into 15 aircraft that would kill them. Torpedo Squadron 8. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, 41 years old, part Sioux, weathered face, quiet voice. The night before, he had written a letter to his pilots. He had told them the mission would be hard. He had told them their aircraft were obsolete. The TBD Devastator was slow, unarmored, and carried a torpedo that often failed to explode, even when it hit. He ended the letter with a promise. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. At 9:20 in the morning, John Waldron found the Japanese carriers. He was alone. His fighter escort had gotten lost. The dive bombers that were supposed to arrive with him were nowhere in sight. He had 15 slow torpedo bombers, no cover, and a horizon full of Zeros. He attacked anyway. The Zeros came down on Torpedo 8 like wolves. One by one, the devastators tumbled into the sea. Waldron's plane went first, or near first. Witnesses disagreed, and there were few witnesses left. All 15 aircraft were shot down. 29 men died in the water or in the wreckage. One survived. Ensign George Gay, 25 years old, the youngest pilot in the squadron, watched his tail gunner die, felt his aircraft shudder from cannon fire, and put his burning Devastator into the ocean. He surfaced beside a floating seat cushion, pulled it over his head to hide from strafing Zeros, and looked up. From the water, less than a mile away, George Gay could see the Japanese carriers. He watched. For hours, he watched. He was the only American who saw the Battle of Midway from inside it. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise came in next. 14 aircraft, 10 shot down. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown came third. 12 aircraft, 10 shot down. Not a single American torpedo hit a Japanese ship. On the bridge of Akagi, the officers watched the American torpedo bombers fall from the sky one after another and dismissed them as brave but stupid. The threat was over. The Zeros had won. Rearm the aircraft. Prepare for the strike on the American carriers. They did not notice what had happened. Every Zero fighter in the Japanese combat air patrol had been pulled down to sea level to slaughter the torpedo bombers. Everyone. The sky above them, the high altitudes where dive bombers strike from, that sky was empty. The 41 men of torpedo squadrons 8, 6, and 3 had died to open a door, and that door was about to be walked through. At that same moment, 40 miles to the north, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was running out of fuel. McCluskey, 40 years old, commander of Enterprise's air group, had led 33 dive bombers to the calculated intercept point. He had found empty ocean. He had turned north when doctrine said to turn back. His fuel was low. His pilots were nervous. Every minute he stayed out was another minute closer to ditching in the Pacific. And then he saw a wake, a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing at flank speed across the empty sea. The Arashi had been left behind to depth charge an American submarine, the Nautilus, that had briefly menaced the Japanese fleet. Now Arashi was hurrying back to rejoin the carriers. McCluskey looked at that white streak of wake pointing northwest across the ocean, and he made his decision. He followed it. He did not know the tactical value of what he was doing. He did not know that the fighter cover above the Japanese fleet was gone. He did not know that on the hangar decks below, bombs and torpedoes lay stacked in the open, fuel lines coiled between them like fuses, waiting for a match. He just followed the wake. At 10:20 in the morning, June 4th, 1942, Wade McCluskey and 33 American dive bombers arrived over the greatest concentration of naval firepower Japan had ever assembled, and looked down through a clear sky at 4 aircraft carriers with no fighter protection overhead. He tipped his wing, and he began to dive. 10:22 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. From 19,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, 32 years old, looked down through his windshield at the flight deck of the carrier Akagi. She was beautiful from that altitude. A long gray shape, carving a white wake through blue water. Aircraft lined up in neat rows on her deck, sunlight glinting off her superstructure. She was the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the ship from which the attack on Pearl Harbor had been launched. And she had no idea Best was there. He pushed his nose over. The dauntless dive bomber fell almost straight down. 70 degrees, engine screaming, dive brakes shrieking. The deck of Akagi swelling in his sight until it filled the world. At 1,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb. He pulled out so hard, the G-forces grayed his vision. The bomb fell for less than 3 seconds. It punched through Akagi's flight deck near the amidships elevator, penetrated into the upper hangar, and exploded among the aircraft that Nagumo had ordered, rear-armed and rear-armed and rear-armed again. Fueled planes, torpedoes stacked in the open, bombs that should have been in the magazines. The explosion was not one blast. It was a chain. One bomb detonated another. One torpedo cooked off another. Fuel lines ruptured and sprayed burning gasoline across the hangar. Within seconds, Akagi was not a warship. She was a furnace. At the same moment, 6 miles away, 3 bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers struck the carrier Soryu. 20 seconds, 3 hits. She was burning from bow to stern. At almost the same moment, 4 bombs from Enterprise struck the carrier Kaga. Her captain died on the bridge. Her hangar became an inferno. 41 American dive bombers made those attacks. 3 were shot down. In 6 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:28 in the morning, the Pacific War was decided. On Akagi's bridge, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo refused to leave. He was 55 years old. He was the commander of the finest carrier force in the world. He had not wanted this operation. He had objected to this plan. And now his flagship was burning beneath his feet, and his sailors were dying in the fires below, and he would not go. His chief of staff, Ryunosuke Kusaka, had to physically pull him away. Together, through rising smoke and the roar of flame from the hangar below, they climbed down a rope to a destroyer waiting alongside. The ship's captain, Taijiro Aoki, 49 years old, stayed aboard longer. He tried to save her. He watched his crew burn. He watched induced explosions tear his ship apart from within. Only at 2 in the morning, on Yamamoto's direct order, did he finally abandon Akagi. At 4:50 in the morning of June 5th, Japanese destroyers put 4 torpedoes into their own flagship to keep her from the Americans. She sank at dawn. Soryu died faster. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, 48 years old, refused to leave. Survivors last saw him alone on the bridge, watching the sea rise to meet him. 711 of his crew died with him. Kaga burned. Longest, her fires could not be controlled. At 7:25 that evening, an internal explosion tore her apart. 811 men died, the worst loss of the 4 carriers. 3 carriers, gone in a single afternoon. But there was still here you. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, 50-year-old commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, watched his 3 sister ships burn from the bridge of Hiryu, the one Japanese carrier that had escaped the American attack. He was, by common agreement, the finest carrier admiral in the Japanese Navy, and he was, in that moment, the only one left. He struck back. 2 waves of aircraft rose from Hiryu that afternoon. They found Yorktown. They hit her with bombs. They hit her with torpedoes. They left her dead in the water, listing, her crew abandoning ship. The Japanese pilots returned to Hiryu, believing they had sunk 2 American carriers. They had hit the same one twice. At 5 in the afternoon, American dive bombers from Enterprise, some of them flown by pilots from the wounded Yorktown, found Hiryu. 4 bombs struck her flight deck. Her fires spread. Her power failed. Yamaguchi refused to leave. He gathered his surviving officers on the flight deck. He gave a short speech, thanking them. He gave his cap to a young officer and asked him to deliver it to his wife. Then he lashed himself to the bridge alongside Captain Tomeo Kaku and waited for the ship to die. At just after 5 in the morning on June 5th, Japanese destroyers scuttled Hiryu with their own torpedoes. Yamaguchi went down with her 4 carriers, all 4. The heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy was on the bottom of the Pacific, 300 miles behind the battle, on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato. Admiral Izoroku Yamamoto listened to the reports coming in and understood what he had done. His operations officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, would later testify that Yamamoto's face did not change. He gave no speech. He made no gesture. He simply stood at the chart table, one hand resting on the wood, and stared at the ocean. At 11:55 that night, he canceled Operation MI and ordered the fleet to withdraw. It was the first time in the war that a Japanese offensive had been called off. Watanabe said, years later, that Yamamoto knew, at that moment, the war was lost. He never said it aloud. He never wrote it down. But he knew. Yorktown almost survived. American damage control was so good, so trained, so relentless, that she was reboarded, patched, and taken under tow. She might have made it home. But on June 6th, a Japanese submarine, the I-168, found her. 2 torpedoes struck her side. One struck the destroyer Hammond alongside, breaking her in 2. Yorktown rolled over at dawn on June 7th and slipped beneath the sea. The final count: Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, 3,057 men, including 110 of the finest carrier aviators in the world, veterans of Pearl Harbor, veterans of the Indian Ocean, veterans of 6 months of unbroken victory. They could not be replaced. America lost one carrier, one destroyer, 150 aircraft, 307 men. When the surviving Japanese warships returned to home waters, the wounded were quietly transferred to hospitals in isolation wards. Their families were not told. Their letters were censored. The Japanese public was informed that Midway had been a great victory. Newsreels showed cheering crowds. The truth was buried under 3 years of official silence. Admiral Yamamoto himself would not live to see the end of the war. On April 18, 1943, 10 months after Midway, American code breakers intercepted a message detailing his flight itinerary through the Solomon Islands. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed his transport plane over Bougainville and shot it down. The same weapon that had killed his carriers had killed him. Signal intelligence, the work of men in basements. Joseph Rochefort, the man in bedroom slippers, the man who had read the enemy's mail, the man without whom Midway could not have been won, was passed over. His superiors in Washington resented his independence. His unit was reorganized. He was quietly transferred to a floating dry dock in San Francisco and spent the rest of the war repairing ships instead of winning battles. He was denied the Distinguished Service Medal that Admiral Nimitz recommended for him 3 times. He died in 1976 without ever receiving it. 9 years after his death in 1985, President Ronald Reagan finally awarded Joseph Rochefort the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously. His widow accepted them on his behalf. Admiral Nimitz, in his official report on the battle, wrote a single sentence that history has not improved upon. Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence. 4 Japanese carriers, 307 American dead. 6 minutes that decided a war. The Empire of Japan would fight for 3 more years. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. But the possibility of Japanese victory in the Pacific died on the morning of June 4th, 1942, northwest of a coral atoll no one had heard of, in 6 minutes of coordinated dive bomber attacks made possible by a man in a basement who read a language he was not supposed to understand. The Japanese expected an easy victory at Midway. Instead, they met the beginning of the end.